please welcome the Atlantic Senior Vice President of Partnerships, Molly Cox.
Good morning. I'm Molly Cox. It's great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us this morning as we explore the next frontier of accessible medicines. How can we improve access and affordability for safe, quality, and effective medicines and treatments? Today, we will discuss the importance of generics and biosimilars and how the industry is adapting to challenges such as rising drug prices, patent reform, and emerging threats, while continuing to provide affordable, high-quality medicines. A housekeeping note, please silence your cell phones, but keep them handy. We encourage you to share your experience here with your social network, so please use the hashtag AtlanticMedicines. Before we begin, I want to sincerely thank our underwriter, the Association for Accessible Medicines, and for their support of the Atlantic's journalism. To share a few opening thoughts, please join me in welcoming the President and CEO of the Association for Accessible Medicines, John Murphy.
Well, thank you, Molly, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here. We have an exciting impact program ahead of us this morning, and we're looking forward to what's sure to be a thoughtful and engaging dialogue. On behalf of AAM and our Biosimilars Council, as well as our members, several of whom are represented here today, we are thrilled to serve as the underwriters of this important and timely briefing. There's a lot to learn about how we can improve access and affordability to safe, quality, and effective generic and biosimilar medicines. For those of you whom we haven't met, AAM is the nation's trade association for manufacturers of generic and biosimilar prescription medicines. Our core mission is to improve the lives of patients by advancing timely access to affordable, FDA-approved generic and biosimilar medicines. Our areas of focus include education, access, regulatory issues, reimbursement, and legal affairs. You all have a copy of the latest iteration of our annual savings report at your seats, and we hope you take a closer look at the information contained therein. It talks a lot about the industry and the value we bring to American patients. Generic and biosimilar drugs represent 90% of all U.S. prescriptions filled daily, but represent only 13% of overall prescription medicine spending in the United States. To put that into context, of all the healthcare spending we undersee here in the United States, generic and biosimilars represent only 1% of U.S. healthcare expenses. And biosimilars themselves represent the future of affordable medicines in this country. As that market continues to grow, 2023 savings from the use of biosimilars increased by more than 30% to $12.4 billion. And since their introduction in 2015, biosimilars have generated $36 billion in savings for the American healthcare system. But as you'll hear from our speakers this morning, the long-term sustainability and success of these industries and the very health of our nation's patients hang in the balance. The rate of drug shortages has increased as manufacturers face challenges, including rapid price deflation, supply chain challenges, Medicare and Medicaid rebate policies that harm generic competition, slower adoption of new products due to abusive PBM financial engineering, and brand drug patent games that throttle access to generic medicines in the short term. The long-term outlook for generic and biosimilar competition hinges on addressing the barriers to development and adoption of these lower-cost medicines. Without action to strengthen generic and biosimilar markets, many lower-cost medicines may disappear and patients will suffer. But we understand that this solution to these problems is not going to come from us as an industry alone. There are critical stakeholders that need to be able to, at the table, to actively participate in solving these complex issues. This is why AAM and the Council are proud to help foster this much-needed dialogue. We are so pleased that the audience and speakers here today represent such a diverse cross-section of these interests. It's critical that we work together to ensure that generic medicines can continue to provide value to patients, taxpayers, employers, and the healthcare system in general, and that biosimilars can deliver on the promise of lower prices and expanded access for patients. So I look forward to getting into this, and thank you all for coming.
Here to discuss the future of prescription drug policy, please welcome Senator Peter Welch of Vermont with Jeanne Meserve, contributor at AtlanticLIVE.
Good morning. Great to have you all here with us today. So 40 years ago, Hatch-Waxman Act was passed, also known as the Drug Price Competition and Patent Restoration Act of 1984. Long name. It's had an impact. It created a pathway for the introduction of generic drugs. It has saved the healthcare system trillions of dollars. But what now? With me here to discuss, Senator Peter Welch of Vermont. Great to have you with us.
Thank you.
So you have made prescription drugs one of your signature issues in Congress. Why is that? Is there a personal story there?
Well, I'll get to a personal story, but you know, the bottom line here is that we absolutely need pharmaceuticals. Drugs extend life and they alleviate pain and suffering. So it's an extraordinarily important component of the healthcare system. The dilemma is that the pricing power that big pharma has is killing us, and we simply can't afford it. So you have a situation where, and this is why I'm so involved, we need access to safe and effective drugs. And when you have a loved one who's told that this is the drug they need, whatever it takes, you're going to pay. You're going to mortgage your house. You're going to get a second mortgage. You're going to go into your retirement savings if that's what it takes, and the doctor tells you this can really make a difference. My first wife had cancer, and we got a lot of help from pharmaceuticals, and it extended her quality of life for a long time. But I've just seen so many people where they are just in agony, emotional agony, about what to do when they get the price tag. So that's why I think it's so important for us to honor and promote the development of drugs, but have an absolute commitment to trying to make them affordable and sustainable. By the way, not just for the individual, but for the taxpayer through Medicare and Medicaid. We all pay for that. And also for employers. You know, employer-sponsored health care is a brutal expense, and our employers want to have good health care for their employees. And one of the major factors increasing the price of that health care premium is the cost of prescription drugs. So I think it's really core and essential for all of us.
Before we look forward, I'd like to look backward for just a moment at the legacy of Hatch-Waxman. Looking back on it, looking at it now, what were its greatest successes in your view, and what are its greatest shortcomings?
Well, Hatch-Waxman had two goals. One is to promote innovation, and the other was to make prescription drugs more affordable. And it's had some success in that. But here's the reality, okay? There's a lot of money to be made if you come up with a blockbuster drug. Look at the weight loss drugs right now, okay? And you have a system where those companies that have that patent have an enormous amount of protection and market power. They get the patent. There's no one who's challenging the protection of intellectual property, although the patent system is being abused enormously to keep biosimilars out, to keep generics out. But you have a situation where the prescription drug companies, they have a patent, no challenge there. But number two, they have a government guaranteed market with Medicare, with Medicaid, with employer-sponsored health care, all right? And taxpayers are paying for that. And then three, they have patients who absolutely have to have that access to the drug. So with that pricing power on the one hand, need, and in some cases desperation on the other hand, there needs to be restraint, and there's no restraint on the part of many of the drug companies. So this effort to make innovation and promote it, that was a Hatch-Waxman goal, but also to have affordability, takes governmental action, because we, as you know, in our country, pay on average 3 times as much for the same drug as paid in Europe, is paid in Canada. And you have a great drug, but if it's out of reach, it's not affordable, it's not going to do much good.
You mentioned the abuse of the patent system. What are you talking about?
The patent thickets, and this is a piece of legislation I have.
And what does a
with
patent? What is a patent?
All right, so you have a patent, right? And it's supposed to expire in so many years. No. The company with the patent is going to challenge the generic whose time has come because the patent has theoretically expired. And what the drug company does is make as many patents apply to that one drug as possible. It's called a patent thicket. So you're a generic and you're about to come online because the stated period of the patent has expired. Well, oh no, you get sued. And you get sued not just because there's an assertion that you're violating a patent that company has for that one drug. They come up with 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 separate assertions of a patent violation by your generic that wants to come onto market. And it's expensive to litigate. So the whole point is intimidation, overwhelming a generic that wants to bring that more affordable drug online at an appropriate time. So that's called a patent thicket, and it just increases the burden on a generic to come to line. And our legislation would essentially limit the opportunity for the patent holder to one assertion as opposed to multiple.
What's the status of that legislation now?
It's pending, but we do have some bipartisan support. And my hope, obviously, is to keep pushing on this because, by the way, this is not a Republican-Democratic issue. Now, it gets, because everybody I talk to, I'm from Vermont, I can talk to my colleagues from Indiana or Texas. They have people who are in the same situation as Vermonters who are going broke or who are scared. Or they have generic companies that want to be able to provide that life-saving, life-extending medication at an affordable price. So this is just a constant battle over pricing power. That's really how I see it. And it's in competition with access. Because if you have a drug but you can't afford it, it doesn't do you much good.
You also supported a proposed rule change to the patent system in September that you say will restore competition to the prescription drug market and lower prices. How would that work?
I'm not sure which one you're talking about. The skinny patent?
I think that's it, yes.
All right. A generic comes online. You have a patent. You've had the benefit, if you're the big pharma company, you've had the benefit of that monopoly patent protection, and you can price to the delight of your shareholders and the terror of many of your customers, okay? But that patent expires. A generic comes online, and it can then sell that drug for the prescribed use for which the patent was granted, but not for other uses. And that was actually in Hatch-Waxman. But it's being thwarted by the efforts of Big Pharma. And this is something that we're about to be introduced, and I'll be working on that with Senator Cotton. And he's a pretty conservative Republican. I'm considered a liberal Democrat, but we're on the same page on this. So my hope is that that's going to be helpful to those in the generic and biosimilar industries that are doing so much to be able to get the medicine we need at prices we can afford.
We hear a lot about pharmacy benefit managers. What exactly are they, and what impact do they have on pricing and availability of generics?
They're outrageous, okay? Pricing, PBMs, they cut deals supposedly for the benefit of bringing prices down for like insurance companies.
They're not doing that, I get.
They're making a lot of money, but they're not saving a lot of money for us, okay? And they're totally opaque. So so number one, how they price and how they operate is something that we have to demand be transparent, because what they may do is give a big discount, but make the buyer pay for a higher cost drug so that the discount that they get themselves or the rebate they get themselves enriches them at your expense or the expense of the insurance plan. The second thing that's so outrageous about them is that they're really destroying our local community pharmacies because of the pricing power that they have and how they don't pass on whatever rebate they get to the actual local pharmacy. And one of the elements of this that I find so disturbing is that we need local pharmacies. You know, when I had a family member who was sick, you get these prescriptions that you have to take. Well, the prescription has to be adjusted for the individual and where you get that good advice. How are you feeling? What are the side effects? That's oftentimes from a local pharmacist who really takes an interest in the patient. So they want to give service, and that's being destroyed. The second thing with losing these community pharmacies is that it starts hollowing out our towns. You know, think about all of us growing up, and you had that local drugstore, and it was friendly people. It was oftentimes local people, but it was a significant element of community life in a small town, and those are getting destroyed. So the PBMs have found a way to make an immense amount of money at the expense of local pharmacies, oftentimes at the expense of our insurance companies, because they're able to conceal rather than be transparent about how they're doing the pricing. So I'm very, very much upset about the kind of power they have and how they're abusing it.
Could you give us an illustration of how this works?
Well, let's say there's 3 drugs that might work for you, and you, in the PBMs, make arrangements with the drug companies, and they might have a drug that would cost, say, $100 or one that costs $200. They may steer you the $200 one because they can get a bigger rebate. They, the PBM, not you, can get a bigger rebate from that manufacturer. So their incentive is not to get the cheapest but effective choice for you. It's to get the biggest rebate for them. That's the incentive. Well, you know, that's not on the level. You understand why the PBM does that, but that's not good for us. We, all aspire to have a healthcare system that's affordable and accessible for everybody. And it's not going to be that way when we have these pricing structures that provide incentives that go against affordability and just are determined to enhance profit at the expense of access. And by the way, innovation as well.
What, if anything, is Congress contemplating doing about the pharmacy benefit managers?
Bipartisan support to rein them in and have transparency. A lot of us think, I served on the Energy and Commerce Committee when I was in the House, and we had a lot of bipartisan support on the focus of transparency, because once you know exactly what they're doing, where there's 3 drugs, let's say in my example, that would work, now all of us are going to choose the most affordable one, right? But if we don't know which is the affordable one, and we have no say in saying, hey, we want drug A versus B or C, we're never going to get anywhere. So this is a situation where I think transparency is our best tool for price protection.
How does the Inflation Reduction Act fit into all of this? We heard during the campaign from the Democratic candidate that it had succeeded in cutting the costs of some drugs. Explain, if you would, what effect it's had.
Well, this is the issue of price negotiation. Okay, this may come as news to folks here, and it doesn't come as news to you, but to a lot of Americans. But we're the only country where the government buys wholesale but pays retail. That's essentially what happens. It's about price negotiation. Can Medicare, can Medicaid negotiate prices when they buy in huge volumes of prescription drugs for the beneficiaries? And the pharma industry has been totally opposed to that. And But just think about you when you're going into the drugstore to buy some aspirin, and you look at the price per unit. And if you get 100, you pay less per unit than if you pay 10, all right? And that's essentially what price negotiation is about. And when the Part D Medicare program was passed many years ago during the second Bush administration, there was a provision that prohibited the government from negotiating bulk price discounts. So that's a pretty weird thing to put in the law, because it just means they set the price and we pay it. So in the Inflation Reduction Act, we finally cracked that for 10 drugs.
Only for 10.
Only for 10. So there should be, my view, there should always be price negotiation. And that's what, we're the only government up until this Inflation Reduction Act on that issue where we didn't have a governmental agency acting on behalf of the public to try to get fair prices for the prescription drugs that the government pays for, that employers pay for, that individuals pay for.
So we have a Republican administration incoming in January. We've got a Republican Senate. We probably will have a Republican House. How will that impact the kinds of initiatives that you've laid out here that would lower pricing, make things more available, and foster innovation?
Did you have to remind me?
Sorry, the new reality.
That was
Catch your breath.
We may have some opportunity here. The first Trump administration, I went over to the White House with Elijah Cummings and met with then President Trump. And he was very emphatic that he wanted to lower prices for prescription drugs.
Trump was emphatic?
He was. No, he actually talked about essentially reference pricing. Should we be paying 3 or 4 times what people pay in Europe or what people pay in Canada? You ask a person randomly on the street, they say, no, I don't think that's a good deal, right? So we were trying to work with him on that. So my view here is that it remains to be seen, because on what he called bidding, but essentially reference pricing, asking the basic question, if America is doing so much through its taxpayers to support the research that goes into creating these great drugs, but then for the benefit of taxpayer-supported research, we get to pay the highest prices in the world, that's not a good deal, all right? So a lot of my Republican colleagues agree with that, and more importantly, Trump has said that he thinks that's unfair. We'll see, we don't know what he'll be, but I see there to be some potential, essentially, to make some progress.
What are the forces at play here, apart from party control on the Hill? What are the big forces at play around these issues?
Look, if you have that kind of pricing power, that you start out with, you get a patent, so you have that total pricing power for the period of the patent. Number 2, you get a government-created market, all right? And then 3, you get the litigation strength to contest the expiration of your patent. That translates into massive profits, massive CEO pay. So if you have that situation, you work pretty hard to keep it. And that's essentially what's going on. That is coming at the expense to taxpayers and to employers with the cost of our health care, which, by the way, our health care system, the biggest threat to access is expense. I mean, we just can't afford having these premiums be going up 15, 20% a year. So there's a real economic incentive for folks who have a pretty good deal now to keep it, and that's essentially what's going on. It gets disguised in every time there's an effort to protect consumers or employers who are paying these high premiums, the assertion is you're going to stifle innovation. All right, so that's the scare tactic. Or you're interfering with the, quote, free market, which is pretty bizarre, since I don't know any other industry where you get such protection on your pricing power for so long, and get the government to create the market for a product that if you're sick, if your partner has cancer, if your child has a disease, you're going to do whatever you have to, including put yourself into bankruptcy to try to extend the life of that person you love.
So if there are not improvements or reforms in the system, what's going to happen? What are the implications?
You know, a lot of heartache for people. You know, you get the bad news that your loved one, and it's always, you know, it's much more acute when it's not you, because somehow you'll find the way to get through it. But if you're a parent and your child needs this, and it's been made out of reach, your partner is now getting the bad news that they've got cancer, and your life is about helping your partner, that is a level of suffering that shouldn't be aggravated with the total anxiety about whether you can afford to get what you need to take care of a person you love. So, you know, that erodes people's sense of place, people's sense of self, and it's just not fair. It's not right. Because the pharmaceutical industry, as I've always said, they do great things with the life-saving, life-extending, pain-relieving medication. But they're abusing the pricing power that they have and taking advantage of the desperation everyone feels when they have a person they love who needs a drug that can really help them. And, you know, we've also seen some of the abuse where, you know, Purdue Pharma, in this, those folks are like drug dealers. That whole family should be in jail right next to Escobar, where they totally abuse and marketed something that has created such an addiction issue here. And that was all a profit motive. They, you know, made billions of dollars and made lots of donations to museums to have their names on it. I mean, that's a little bit of a sidebar, but it shows you what can happen when there is unrestrained power to set prices and then to market something, in this case, that caused so much suffering for so many people in all of our communities around the country.
If there is no reform, what does it do to the viability of generics? Is that potentially in jeopardy?
Well, generics are the path forward. I mean, you know, generic has kind of an old-fashioned notion that you provide a reasonable service at a reasonable price. That's like, used to be the American way, right? It kind of works. So we've got to do everything we can to help generics and biosimilars get that medicine that folks need out at an affordable price. And generic companies make money, their shareholders do good, do well. So it's just you know, we've got to restore. You don't have a totally free market here when you have a patent system in a government-created market. What you have is a situation that can be abused, and it has been. And I think generics and biosimilars have that old-fashioned notion, a reasonable product, good product at a reasonable price.
Senator Peter Welch, Democrat of Vermont, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And now, for a conversation produced by our underwriter, the Association for Accessible Medicines, on charting a path for patients, generics, and biosimilars in the next decade. Please welcome John Murphy, President and CEO of the Association for Accessible Medicines, with Molly Cox, Senior Vice President of Partnerships at the Atlantic.
All righty. Hi again, John.
Hello, everyone.
All right, let's get right to it. We heard from the senator this morning about issues impacting, from his perspective, the long-term sustainability of the generics market. From the industry's perspective, what does that mean? Where do you see biosimilars in particular in the next 10 years, and what are the opportunities and challenges?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things to unpack here, but let's hit a number of these issues briefly. So as I mentioned when I started, right, we're looking at an industry that represents 90% of daily prescription fills in the United States, and that's really laudable. And the 40 years since the passage of Hatch-Waxman have really ushered in an environment where we can rely on this sort of stable, inexpensive pathway for medicines that the vast majority of patients see. But you raise a sustainability issue, and that's because there's a couple of critical factors that are starting to really eat into the ability of this industry to be sustainable. On the one hand, you have this race to the bottom. It's become this coined phrase where, you know, the hyper competitivity of the industry has created a pricing scenario where a very small amount of purchasers represent the vast majority, almost monopolistic aspect of the market, and they're demanding lower and lower and lower prices. And you get to a point where, for a number of these older medicines that are still critical to day-to-day care, they can't be produced in the United States and sold at a loss for a continual period of time, right? We're hitting the point where the GPO market, the PBM market, is demanding such a low price that you can't cover your costs of production. And that's really threatening a number of the day-to-day chronic medicines that are generic for a long period of time, and that is a threat to the sustainability of the market. So I think on the one hand, we have a reimbursement issue, right? Mm-hmm. And we have to think about, I talked to an AAM board member recently who said they were at a meeting with Walmart, where Walmart was trying to evaluate how do they address some of the shortages they're seeing in their pharmacy clinic. And they said they were open to all these ideas, and they wanted to hear novelty. And this board member said, well, I raised up and I said, you need to pay a penny more a pill for all these medicines. And he said the conversation ended. They were unwilling to have further conversation about that. So on the reimbursement side, that's something we really have to fix. Now, something that Senator Welch did a really good job of explaining is also there's a number of competitive problems that are eating into the promise of generic and biosimilar medicines. Let's talk about biosimilars for a second. These are supposed to be the sort of biologics, generics future, right? There's a medicine on the market right now, I won't name it, I'm sure you'll figure it out, which now has 10 biosimilar competitors in the US marketplace. That brand drug still has 82% of the market share in the United States. So, you know, you ask, what does that mean for the long-term sustainability of biosimilars? What's the incentive for the next biologic medicine to be developed in the biosimilar context if they're looking at the market for this other drug and saying, at best, I get 10% market share, and it's going to cost me $200 to $300 million to develop this product. So, you know, I think we have to address, and a number of the pieces of legislation that the senator talked about would help in that model. But I think there's a number of systemic changes that we're going to have to work on a bipartisan basis over the next several years to try and fix those problems.
That is a great segue into my next question. I'll remind the room again, there was an election last week. So with a new Congress and a new administration, what are your priorities for 2025 and all of the new staffers that come with that?
Yeah, so I would say priority number one is education. And the reason for that is because the senator, I think, is a champion for our cause, is a real leader in the industry, but you have a number of new members who are coming into Congress, both on the House and the Senate side. I would imagine, and I don't imagine this, I know this, right? Our industry is looked at as sort of part of Big Pharma, and they associate us with, okay, well, that's just Big Pharma, and there's all these pricing problems, and we're going to hammer Big Pharma. They should hammer Big Pharma, but they should also understand that this industry is a very different and distinct component of the healthcare system, and we have to spend a lot of time getting in there with all these new members and saying, here's the promise of the industry, here's the current state of the industry, and here are a number of specific solutions that can address the long-term sustainability issues and ultimately help patients and employers actually afford a number of their medicines. So on the one hand, I would say education, but I don't want to ignore the fact that there's a number of bipartisan objectives sitting has introduced legislation that could help patent thickets, skinny labeling, both the priorities of the senator. I think we have to embrace the fact that even Republicans care about healthcare costs. And ultimately, we can, I think, find some common ground to chart a path forward, even in this next Congress.
So you mentioned being lumped in with big pharma sometimes. That sort of reminds me, so you come from a brand industry background. I would love to hear a little bit personally about what it's like to change sides. What has surprised you? What do you view as some of the biggest challenges to the future of the generic and biosimilars industries?
Yeah, so you're right. So previous to this role, I spent 17 years in a number of roles on the branded side. And side's kind of a misnomer, right? I mean, I think we're all objectively working towards better patient health. So I wouldn't say we're on opposing teams, but we have different objectives in how we look at things, right? On the branded side, it's like a showstopper, right? You walk in, you say, policy X will hurt innovation. And from an industry standpoint, it's a super easy narrative, right? Nobody wants to hurt innovation. But I think what I've really seen since I've come over to the generics and biosimilar side is I think we need to have a conversation as America in the context of innovation and say, is innovation at all costs where we want to go? Because we're threatening the ability to get that ADHD medicine that our kids need, to get a sustainable market for azithromycin and other antibiotics, all of which are generic medicines that have kind of, in the public perception, fallen by the wayside because they're cheap and they're easy and they're always there. And that's not true. And I think for me, I've really had a bit of an epiphany. I used to think that we would talk about innovation at all costs because it was really, really important. And I think now we have to really sit back and think, is that the kind of feature we want? Because we're ignoring 90% of the medicine system there. And we have to really refocus American policy towards that side of the aisle.
A conversation I think we'll grapple with across industries in the years ahead. So lightning round to close us out. We've highlighted a lot of problems, a lot of issues, a lot of work ahead. End us on a more positive note. Where do you see bright spots?
Yeah, I think that there is those opportunities for bipartisanship to really harness the power of this market and bring patients a number of affordable options in the future. I see that as a bright spot. I do think that the lexicon of drug pricing, of unaffordability in the insurance market, I think it is becoming a situation that nobody can ignore anymore. And I think that's going to push us in a direction of we need to listen to that part of the sector that says they're struggling, that's calling out for help. And it's time for us to actually get down to business and work on that.
Thank you, John.
Thanks so much.
And now, for a conversation on expanding access, the impact of biosimilars, please welcome Murray Aitken, Executive Director of the IQVIA Institute for Human Data Science, Christine Baeder, President of Apotex USA, with Jeanne Meserve, contributor at AtlanticLIVE.
So I think at this point we've heard a little bit about biosimilars. And that they are, am I correct? Correct me if I'm wrong. They're the generic version of biologics, correct? Okay. If you would, tell me if there are specific therapeutic areas where you are seeing biosimilars used.
Well, we're seeing them used really wherever there are biologics that have lost exclusivity. So some of the biggest cancer drugs, Avastin and so on, are now available as biosimilars. And interestingly, biosimilars represent about 60% now of the volume of those really backbone cancer drugs that have been used for many years. So that's one example. And then immunology is the other big area where we're seeing increased availability of biosimilars, although the use is not at that high level yet.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you if there are other areas where you think they could be of more use than they currently are.
I think what's important to remember about biosimilars is the generic industry has saved approximately $3 trillion for the system in the last 10 years.
And how much of that is because of biosimilars?
A smaller percentage, a few million, 36 million-ish. What's important to know, though, is as science advances, the savings that we've historically gotten from small molecule products, because the real difference between a biosimilar and a generic is it's a large molecule versus a small molecule, we will not continue to be able to save that money for the system unless we figure out how to skin the problem of creating incentives that support biosimilars. And biosimilars will be in all disease states. There are certain places where they're sort of leading, but the science is going in that direction. So eventually it could be, a very vast percentage of the drugs that are available.
Okay, but are we at this point in time seeing all the possible use cases of biosimilars?
Not yet, because the patents aren't there yet. But we will get there. We will get to a place where most of the drugs that are coming off of patent are actually a biologic or a biosimilar. Or, by the way, the next thing, gene therapy.
What is the price differential between a biologic and a biosimilar?
That's an easy question with lots of ways to answer it,
Yeah.
because they're priced to whom? So what we've been watching is certainly a decline in the net prices for biosimilars. We see a range of between 15 and 45% reduction in the pricing. But there's a lot of peculiar things that go on in and around pricing that we can get into, including what you heard referenced from the senator, which is sometimes the lower cost drug is not the preferred one and not the one being purchased. And specifically in biosimilars, we've had the case where there have been biosimilars made available at two different prices, a high price and a low price. And guess which price is preferred by the payers? They like the high price one because that one comes with a significant rebate that gives them the flexibility to do whatever they want to do with that rebate amount. So, this is the Alice in Wonderland nature of the US health system, that perversely, when a lower priced option of the same molecule becomes available, it's not necessarily preferred by the person buying it from the manufacturer.
So are the pharmacy benefit managers, who the senator talked about, are they a critical piece of this and why it assumes this Alice in Wonderland quality?
Yeah, they are very much sort of in the middle of this. Again, they have their explanation of how they run their business and so on. I think fundamentally what happens in the US healthcare system is we have a lot of what I would call cross-subsidization going on, and the PBMs have the ability to sort of take money from here and put it over there. There's a trade-off between premium increases and patient out-of-pocket increases that they are in the middle of as well. So there's lots of different ways, but definitely the PBMs are a critical part of the equation here.
And maybe just to get to your question very specifically, in a generic world, when you have 10 competitors on the market, the price point is generally less than 10% of what the innovator's price would be. We're not seeing the promise of that in biosimilars yet, and there's several reasons. One is also patient adoption, right? There was a lot of educational initiatives when generics, after Hatch-Waxman. We need to invest that same type of education so that patients really understand biosimilars and are very comfortable with biosimilars and also feel the savings. The system that we have, the patient doesn't feel any different at the counter.
So we aren't just talking about education, we're also talking about incentives.
Yes.
Do physicians also need to be educated?
Yeah, they need education, and we need science. We need data to build that comfort base. These are complicated disease states, and physicians are very much entitled to an understanding that these drugs are safe and efficacious. And as an industry, we need to support that. But we also need the patient to go to the pharmacy counter after they've gotten the education that, hey, a biosimilar is okay, and say, you know what, this is amazing. I now get a biosimilar for $5, and I used to pay, my deductible used to be $200. That drives change.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things on that. One is certainly physicians have come a long way in the last 15 years or so with respect to biosimilars, helped by the fact that Europe is about 10 years ahead of the US in terms of using biosimilars, gathering data about their safety and effectiveness, and so that information does sort of, you know, trickle across. Yes, it does. But still, there is some hesitancy by probably a third or so of physicians about biosimilars.
Have you pinpointed why?
Well, I think it's just that they want the confidence that the patient will not suffer, and if they don't see a benefit to the patient, then why bother? Is sort of the attitude that they, not unreasonably, frankly, have. If there's no benefit to the patient, why would I switch them off the branded version of the drug?
You mentioned that Europe is far ahead of the US when it comes to biosimilars. Why is that the case?
Well, Europe created the pathway for biosimilars earlier than the US. In the US, there was actually no mechanism for a biosimilar to exist. There was a mechanism for small molecule generics to exist, and Hatch-Waxman was a big part of that. But there was no equivalent pathway in the U.S. until the so-called Biosimilars Act was passed. So so Europe is well ahead. There are other issues in Europe, by the way. We probably don't have the time or interest to go there, but in terms of the safety and efficacy of the biosimilars, there's a ton of evidence out of the European experience that should, that everyone should understand in this country.
And look, I just want to say, we hear all the time that Americans pay 3 times as more, 4 times as more. That's not true for generics. We actually pay less for generics than anywhere in the world. Anywhere in the world. And that promise could be true for biosimilars as well. We have to fix the incentives. We have to do the education. We have to do the hard work. But there's a promise there that we're not grabbing.
Are we paying too little for generics and biosimilars?
I think we are in a point where we threaten the sustainability. And specific to biosimilars, the problem that we face now is these products are complicated. They take years to bring to the market. The investment is huge, hundreds of millions of dollars, and you're not guaranteed success. So without a clear path of how to return your investment, there will be less and less investment. And then that will drive less and less biosimilars. This is why it's a problem for right now.
And why are prices too low? Does it come back again to those pharmacy benefit managers? Is that again
there's a host of reasons that they're too low. One of them is because there is a concentration of market power. That's just economic system. You have a few buyers and you have a lot of suppliers. One of them is because of the reimbursement mechanisms. And something that's sort of insidious in our market, which we always kind of talk around the edges, is can you think of any crazy system where you go to the pharmacy counter, the person standing next to you got the same prescription, they paid a different amount. The person, down the street paid a different amount. Nobody knows what anybody pays. Like, the lack of transparency makes it very easy for there to be a lot of perverse incentives. Because if it was all transparent, people would say, well, that's not fair. That doesn't make any sense. And then we could actually deal with it. But we don't have enough systematic data available to really attack the problem.
So who should be collecting that data? Is this a matter of private insurance companies? Is this Medicare? Is this, whose bailiwick would this be?
Well,
to
you'd
get
have
the
to
data?
have some legislation to really attack transparency as a concept. Because to your point, there's pockets of data everywhere.
And is there any prospect of that kind of legislation?
I think there is. There's more and more conversation, yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely more conversation about bringing greater transparency. A lot of that is focused on the so-called middlemen, the PBMs, and as the senator also mentioned, right, showing exactly what they are paying, how much rebates they are receiving, and then what they are doing with those rebates. I think that know exactly how that would play out, because sometimes transparency actually ends up increasing prices. So you've got to be careful what you wish for, but certainly the sort of opaque and bizarre system that we have now, to your point, where I mean, and there are surveys done of what it costs at retail pharmacies for the same generic, and the level of variability is extraordinary, and that's because there's a lack of transparency.
So commercial health insurers have a part in this big puzzle of biosimilars. What about Medicare?
Well, absolutely. I mean, all of the payers have a role to play. So Part B of Medicare, which is where most but not all of the biosimilars are flowing for hospital or infused products, they have a role. Medicare Part D, which is where self-injectable kinds of drugs flow, they absolutely have a role to play as well.
And let me just say on that, the IRA, which addresses Medicare, this negotiation, the senator said it's 10 drugs. It's 10 drugs the first year. The idea is that it will be multiple drugs over multiple years. That's an actual threat to biosimilars.
Wow.
Unintended. But because that creates an environment where you have a company investing in biosimilars, and now they have no idea what the price point will be when they come to market. So look, there was some thought about that, and I appreciate that the legislatures, they called out the fact that we need a little bit more time for biosimilars. They put some clauses in there very specific to biosimilars, sort of at least acknowledging that they're different and we need to take care of them, but it's not enough. Like, there needs to be a different way of thinking about the value that biosimilars bring to market, because otherwise what happens is you'll get a negotiated price for the brand. Okay, I guess that's better, but it's never going to be 90% off. It's never going to be the savings and the promise of the value that biosimilars could truly bring to the market.
Talk to me about patent litigation. It was brought up with the senator. He said that's a big factor here. You agree?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of lawyers spend a lot of time trying to protect intellectual property beyond the sort of what I would call the core patent of a molecule. Sometimes that's because there's more investment going into the drug to find additional uses for the drug or additional subpopulations who will benefit from that drug. And I don't think we want to discourage that. But in other cases, it's just creating obstacles for the generic companies or the biosimilar companies to face, because anytime they challenge those patents, it triggers a legal fight that's expensive, that takes time, and that's really not where the focus should be, right? I mean, this is just trying to put barriers up to prevent these the biosimilar manufacturers from being able to enter the market, at the expiration of the core patent.
I fully agree, and the other thing I would say about that is the more patents there are, just that alone becomes a challenge for generic companies because they're outgunned, right? The innovative companies have infinitely more cash than the generic companies just because of the nature of the business. So every time they have to challenge a patent, that's another investment. So you can literally just patent it to death, even though the patents would never stand up, but the company's not going to have enough money to litigate them all.
And all due respect to generic manufacturers and biosimilar manufacturers, the originator companies tend to be able to access and utilize better lawyers. So I think that's frankly a part of it too.
More money.
Yes.
So what's happening to the biosimilar industry then? Given all these obstacles, are there companies just dropping out?
So what we've seen so far is we've seen companies that had pipelines marketing their pipe, like they don't want it, they're trying to get someone else to buy it. You're seeing decisions in boardrooms every day where they're investing less, investing differently in biosimilars. That's why this is a burning platform. This is not an issue that we have 10 years to figure out. We need to figure out what the incentives are now so that we get the investment and we get to the full promise of the true savings that biosimilars can deliver.
And I think part of the thing to remember is the decisions need to be made today for biosimilars that won't actually make it through the development process and onto the market for at least 5 years or 10 years. And the investments in the manufacturing capacity are also, measured in the hundreds of millions of dollars. These are big bets that are made with very long timelines. We're sitting here at the end of 2024, almost 2 years since the patent expiry of the largest biologic, adalimumab, which has 10 or so biosimilars competing for a share of that adalimumab molecule's market, with an expectation that by now those biosimilars would have taken a very substantial share of the market. It hasn't turned out that way, and I think this is definitely triggering everyone to reassess what that future really is for this market.
Could you talk a little bit more about the reality of biosimilars trying to get a market share? How tough is it? And can you give me a specific example where there are biosimilars that are available, that are approved, and they haven't been able to make a significant bite?
Well, I think he gave the best example and the best statistic, and I'll defer to you for the number. But the first year that there were biosimilars available, they had what, 1 share? They had 2% market share. That's not a functioning market. Like, why is there a more affordable option available, and after an entire year, you have 2% market share? There's something very systemically broken in the system.
Okay, and in that instance, what was the factor? Why does it only have 2%?
It's the rebate wall. The way the system is set up, there's so much incentive financially for different stakeholders, not just the PBM, to stay with the branded molecule, and a lack of incentive for patients and doctors to make the change.
And let me make it clear that when we're talking about the health benefit managers, we're talking about financial incentive.
Yes.
It's all about the money. So I read that 86% of brand biologics that are eligible for biosimilar competition do not even have a biosimilar under development. What does that say about the health or lack of health?
Yeah, so we track all the biologics and look at the biosimilars that are in development, and I think that statistic is reflecting the reassessment of by biosimilar manufacturers as to whether in fact they can whether they should be making the investment into the next set of biologics that will lose patent expiry and enter the market. There are also a lot of biologic medicines that are for rare diseases and have actually relatively small patient populations. They may be high priced per unit, but the total revenue for those drugs may be quite low, less than $100 million, for example. And there the question is there a sufficient market for biosimilar manufacturers to make the investment to do the clinical trials that are still needed to register the biosimilar product and enter a market if it's less than some certain threshold. So that's one of the dynamics as well that we're seeing.
What I would say about that is, when it comes to the orphan drug, rare disease type of molecules, that's where we really need the partnership of the FDA and working with us on what's required, how do we do that, can we get to global standards? Like, there's a lot of things that we can do in that regulatory space that are not legislative that would perhaps help spur the competition for those smaller smaller markets of biosimilars.
What kind of partner has the FDA been to this point? Is the approval process, for instance, swift enough?
So what I would say is the FDA is actually taking on this challenge in a way that they, historically have not been as aggressive. So we're moving in the right direction, and they're moving with haste. I mean, they are really trying to figure it all out. It's complicated. It's hard science. This is not an easy thing. We're not where we need to be, but there is an appetite to get there. So I'm very hopeful that we will.
The FDA can also help lower the cost of developing the biosimilar for registration. So there is draft guidance out that would reduce the need for the clinical trials to be conducted, or the extent of those trials to confirm that the biosimilar is equivalent to the originator drug. The European Medicines Agency, by the way, has also moved further down that pathway as well. So that would be one aid to take costs out of development, which again changes some of the decisions about whether to develop biosimilars for the market. I would say the FDA, has been a very strong and positive partner because they understand the critical role that biosimilars and generics play in a well-functioning biomedical system. And there are certain levers that they control that I think they've been exercising quite well.
Dream-o-vision time. If each one of you had to lay out the top, let's say, 3 things that need to change in order to create a more robust biosimilar ecosystem, what would those 3 action steps be?
The first one would be that the patient experience for generics and biosimilars should be that they pay less at the counter. There should not be manipulation of the experience so that, medications that cost the system more are incentivized and the patient has to pay. If the patient feels the savings, the patient will help drive the change. That would be the first one. The second one would be what he was just talking about, would be some sort of redesign of what we need to do as far as clinical trials and, what can we do by more scientific methodology in mathematical equations as opposed to actual patient testing.
I mean, to me, the key one is the transparency of pricing. We've got to get the rebate distortion sort of out of the system so that we don't end up with this, again, upside-down world where payers prefer to pay the higher price for a drug when there's a lower price option available, right? We've got to get through that for the benefit of the entire system, ultimately.
So given the results of the recent election and the stated objective of the incoming administration to lessen regulation, how optimistic or pessimistic are you that the changes that you want to see made will in fact be made?
I'm still trying to digest where we're going, as I think much of the country is. I am hopeful. There is an appetite that is bipartisan to figure this out, to solve drug shortages, as well as make medications more affordable for people. So there aren't a lot of issues in this town right now that everyone sort of agrees on, and those are a couple. And we did it before. I mean, Hatch-Waxman was wildly successful. We have a generic industry that services patients, and that I can't think of any other examples where you have private industry and the legislative branch and the regulators working together and creating benefit for the American public. That gives me hope. The question is, how do we get there? What do they tackle first? And it's the unintended consequences. When people are angry at pharma, they need to remember that the laws that they pass also affect the good guys, the generics and the biosimilars, and we need to remember that we're all not the same.
Yeah, I think, from a politician's perspective, when they talk about drug prices being out of control, they hear that from their citizenry, who is reflecting not what the manufacturer negotiates with the PBM, it's what their out-of-pocket is at the pharmacy counter, typically, or what their share is if it's a hospital drug that they've received or infused in a clinic. So it's that out-of-pocket cost. And what the politicians don't always understand is there's a very tenuous link between the amount that a manufacturer receives for a drug and the amount that the patient is paying out of pocket. I mean, it's very tenuous. The assumption is, well, of course, there's a direct link between one and the other. There's not, which is, well, and we can give lots of examples of that. So I think, there are ways to strengthen that linkage, which I think would be very helpful. For example, the rebates that are negotiated, the patient doesn't necessarily see the benefit of those rebates in terms of lower out-of-pocket cost. If they did, it would change the equation and promote greater utilization of biosimilars, and the patients would benefit and the politicians would be happy as well. I think we've got to really sort of lean into this issue that it's the patient out-of-pocket costs that get that need to be addressed, and there are ways to go about that.
So if changes aren't made very quickly, what's the result going to be?
You'll never recognize the promise that biosimilars hold. And without the promise of biosimilars, the savings that we've enjoyed from the trail of generic drugs won't be there. And why is that a problem? Not only is that a problem because you don't have affordable access to medicine for millions and millions of people, it's also a problem because that money in the system that we save on generics funds innovation. And I want to live in a world where we get rid of cancer, and I want to live in a world where we don't have Alzheimer's, but you need funds in the system that are released by the hard work of generics and biosimilars to fund that innovation.
We already have 46% of the total amount spent on all drugs in the United States going to biologics, right? And that percentage is steadily increasing, right? It's where the science has taken us. So the inability of biosimilars to operate in a sustainable, competitive marketplace, bringing lower prices to payers and to patients. If we don't have that, it's going to be a bigger and bigger problem just because of the mix of biologics versus small molecules. So it is critical that we get this right? We need both biosimilar manufacturers and generic manufacturers to be in business, to be competitive, to be able to make enough money to stay in the business and invest in what they need to invest in so that we can continue to see the lower prices at the end of the exclusivity period.
Maria Aitken, Christine Baeder, thank you both for your insights this morning. Appreciate it.
All right, thank you to everyone for being here with us this morning. Thank you especially to our underwriter, the Association for Accessible Medicines, and thank you also to our speakers for lending their insights to the conversation. Have a great morning.